So thank you for inviting us and for the coalition for having us. We appreciate the opportunity. And for the minister, Comcast does not really host websites, so if they're in the US, they're not ours, but we might be able to help you find them. A little bit of a background, and David did a very nice job summarizing the current state of sort of legal activity in the US around IP and copyright. I'm going to give you a view of a private initiative, a voluntary initiative of best practices between internet service providers and the creative industries. So I'll talk a little more tactically and less strategically and at a policy level, but I promise not to bore you with too many implementation details, because there are many, and trust me, they're very boring. A little bit of background if you're not familiar with Comcast. In the US, we are the largest cable services provider. In 2011, I think we had just under $60 billion US in revenue, and combined subscriber base of about 50 million users between our cable television, internet, and telephone services. Comcast has long had an interest in the content creation world. We have created and established a number of cable television networks, and also in the sports world. Until recently, we owned 2 of the local Philadelphia sports teams. We now own 1, the Philadelphia Flyers, which is the ice hockey team. So we have a lot of experience in the content creation world and actually in the sporting world as well. And then you may know that as of last January in 2011, Comcast closed its acquisition of a deal to take over NBC Universal, and we now operate that as the controlling partner in a joint venture with General Electric. So now, as part of the Comcast family, we have the NBC Universal family of content, the broadcast television networks in the US, Universal Movie Studios, and the cable networks, which is, of course, a global business. And many of my colleagues from NBC are here today from the London office, so it's nice to meet many of them in person and see them. What's the problem we're dealing with in the US? We have a fairly robust copyright system, as David will attest to. And we have some specific laws that are recent in the last dozen or so years that talk about infringement and online, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or the DMCA. The challenge is that, and this is a point I'll get to at the end, laws are very helpful and very necessary in many ways, but they're not often very flexible, and they don't adapt quickly to changing technologies and changing behaviors and attitudes. And the DMCA is a good example. When it was passed and went into effect in 1998, the largest online infringement problem was people putting scanned pictures from magazines, usually Playboy, on websites so that other people could see them and download them. That world is now long since gone, and the problem for copyright owners of all types is largely in the peer-to-peer, or the online sharing between computers, where the internet service provider like Comcast plays a role as a conduit. We provide a connection, but we don't see the content, we don't host it, we don't act on it. And that's a little bit of a gap. And the notice and takedown model of the DMCA that works well in a hosted scenario, I see my movie on your website, I send you a notice, and if it's compliant, you act to take it down and following the procedures, doesn't work in a conduit peer-to-peer model where no one can see what's happening except maybe at the edges and with very, very blurry vision. So what the internet service providers and the content industries have been doing for years, and this certainly predates our merger with NBC, has been talking about what can we as responsible internet service providers do to make a real substantial contribution to the online piracy issue. And so we've had a number of discussions over the years with individual companies and with the content community through the trade associations about different things that we might be able to do, balancing all of the different interests that I'm sure you appreciate in terms of customer relations and privacy and security and business model. And where we came out ended up in a memorandum of understanding that was released and announced last July of 2011 between the top 5 internet service providers, including Comcast, and the 2 trade associations, the MPAA on the movie side and the RIAA on the record company side. And it was to create, on a voluntary basis, a system around copyright alerts. Now, the other term you may have heard quite a bit is graduated response. The basic idea being that there would be a system and a mechanism that each internet service provider would implement so that when a copyright owner submitted a valid and legitimate complaint alleging infringement, that the service provider would take that, process it, communicate it to its customer, and the graduated response, or the graduation idea, is that over time, if there were a number of these notices, the requirement would be increased for the subscriber to acknowledge and act on the notice. So for example, the first time I might just get an email. The second time I might have to log into something and say, yes, I've read that, I understand that there's been this complaint, and I will act accordingly. The kind of the graduation model. So the copyright alert system does a number of things, just a few quick highlights. It's a common framework for notice forwarding. Under the DMCA, we have long had notice and takedown, which is the model where copyright owners look for infringements wherever they may find them. They send a compliant notice to the internet service provider. The service provider then verifies it's a compliant notice and acts on it and gives a copy to its subscriber. Privacy is maintained. No internet service provider gives the name of the subscriber to the content provider. But if the notice goes unchallenged and the ISP has the ability to take the content down, it does. And there's a process for the subscriber to challenge that. So we have a notice model in US law that we've worked with. The copyright alert system really takes that and adds a number of features to it. The basic idea behind the system was to be educational and informative to subscribers, not to be punitive. It was to tell them what's happening over your internet service may be illegal. Many people may not know that, or they may know it and think I'm never going to get caught. Or they may be honestly confused. As David mentioned and others have mentioned, there are a number of pirate websites that look legitimate. They carry ads for name brands that we all recognize and whose products we purchase. They accept credit cards by issuers that we all use. They look very legitimate. So people may legitimately be fooled in some cases. So the customers, we think, as service providers, and almost as a customer disclosure idea, have a right to know that what's happening over their internet accounts and service may be illegal. And there's also a security element as well. Many times it is not difficult to download content that contains viruses or Trojans or other harmful code that could not only steal your identity, but ruin your computer. Our experience also in the policy enforcement world as an internet service provider, in other areas, for example, if you don't pay your bill enough times, we may actually have to suspend your account, or if you abuse the service or steal bandwidth or things like that, is that the vast, vast majority of customers, the first time that we reach out to them directly and say, we understand this is happening, can we talk, they never do it again. And that's true of a number of things that we've done. We have a fairly active enforcement of excessive bandwidth usage. We have a very, 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 very high monthly data usage threshold on our service. We have people who each month exceed the theoretical maximum of that cap. We're not quite sure how, but they manage to do it. And in that model, when we reach out to people and explain the situation, it's usually, I don't know what's going on, and they've been infected with a Trojan or a virus or some other computer problem that's easy to fix, or they knew darn well what they were doing, and largely they never do it again. We think the same will be true in the copyright alert model, that most people who receive notices the first or second time will not do whatever it is they were doing if they understood it to be impermissible. And we think that's a good thing. Again, the goal is educational and informative. It's not to be punitive. It's not to cut people's service off. That's not a feature of this. It's not to slow their bandwidth to a trickle so they can't do anything. That's not a feature of this. But there are a number of techniques or mitigation steps that service providers can decide to use to try and get subscribers' attentions if for whatever reason they don't act on the notices. There obviously has to be a tremendous amount of integrity in the notices that come in. They have to be accurate, they can't be spurious, and a lot of the work going into designing the copyright alert system and all the implementation work we're doing now is around that, making sure that the entire ecosystem, both on the content owner side, identifying alleged infringements, has integrity and accuracy, and likewise on the ISP side, when we receive those, that we respond to them and process them accurately, and we identify the right account, not the wrong account. There is an appeals process, so just as in law you have the right to take your case, and if you don't like the result you can usually appeal it. We have an independent review process under the copyright alert system so that subscribers who think they've been wrongly accused or whatever their conduct was legitimate have an ability to go to, we're using the American Arbitration Association as the arbiter, to go to them and follow a prescribed process to say, it wasn't me, it wasn't my account, or I have a right to that piece of content that is the basis of a notice. And then there's a process there that they can follow through. It's not preclusive of going into court, but it's designed to be a quick, inexpensive, efficient administrative mechanism for people who legitimately object to get their appeal aired. A couple of other things in designing the copyright alert system that we took very seriously and built into it, as is probably the case here and in other countries. The cable services platform delivers a number of things, not just cable TV or internet or telephone. People use it for all sorts of things. They may monitor their health. They may have a connection to their hospital or their doctor. So it was very important that any system we created and any consequences or mitigation steps that the ISP might take as a matter of policy if someone went too far through the system with too many notices did not disrupt any essential services. So no matter what service providers do in terms of establishing consequences or mitigation steps, you can still make phone calls, you can still call emergency services, you can still, connect your hospital, all of those things. Very important that we not disrupt the very critical sort of lifeline services that people use over our platform, in addition to all of the other entertainment and work activities that they may do. And then finally, one of the goals of the system was to create a Center for Copyright Information, whose mission will be to get good, legitimate, accurate information out there about copyright, help people understand what's right and what's wrong, and also drive them towards legitimate sources of content. A big complaint over many years has been, gee, I'd love to do the right thing, but I can't find this movie, I can't find this song legitimately anywhere. Where can I get it? I have to pirate it. I think largely that's no longer a valid position. Almost all of the popular content across all sectors is available legitimately somewhere, and more is coming up all the time. So part of what we're doing with this system is not only telling people there's been an objection from a copyright owner, please govern yourselves accordingly. It's also there's legitimate places to get this content and drive people to those as well and let them make the decision. So in closing, my point about the DMCA and the law that we have really ties to this. The copyright alert system really responds to an inflexibility in some way in the DMCA and sort of the unpredictability of the legislative process. We think as ISPs and the content industry that we work with agrees with us that a voluntary, flexible program is really a good model to follow. We can adapt quickly to changes in technology and behavior. We don't have to go through a legislative process to do that. We have a very transparent and open process. The Center for Copyright Information website's available. The MOU we signed is available. We will be revising that and putting a tremendous amount of material up there. We have an advisory board composed of a variety of public interest advocates to sort of help give us a strong customer perspective on what we're doing. And the goal is to be flexible and to learn ourselves. We will probably all roll this out as ISPs by the end of 2012. And we will take checkpoints every 3 or 6 or 12 months, and we will learn as we go. And if we see that one thing is working well, we'll probably continue that. If we see something is not working well, we'll probably rethink that. And this gives us the flexibility to do that relatively quickly and to hear from our customers and hear from all the constituents that have an interest in this. So in closing, I would just recommend the voluntary best practices model as one to strongly consider. I know that with the DEA and implementation pending here, maybe it's too late for that, maybe not, from what I've gathered in some of my conversations. But it's a model that we think can work. There's other examples in U.S. Commercial enterprises where these voluntary best practices efforts have worked fairly well. We think this is a valuable and useful contribution to make a dent in the privacy problem, to give customers good information to work with. And at the end of the day, we hope it's successful and we have the ability to change it and fine-tune it to be more flexible as we go. So that's an overview of what we're doing. Thank you.
just to clarify,
Yes.
it's not in operation yet.
It's not in operation yet by the end of this year.
Okay. Is everybody playing ball? What about Google and Facebook?
No, right now the members are the top 5 internet service providers in the U.S. and then the motion picture studios and the record companies. It's a good point, which is, it took, I won't tell you how many years to get this done, but there's a much larger ecosystem of interested parties here. There's payment processors, and David talked about an agreement last year in that space. There's search engines, there's websites, there's domain name registries, there's advertisers. There's a whole range of players in the internet ecosystem that could be at this table or at a table like this. They're not there yet, not because they've necessarily resisted, but because we had to start where we had to start.
But presumably without them,
right,
it's not going to be as effective as it might be.
What the participation of the internet service providers will certainly, I think, capture a tremendous amount of the online infringements that the content owners see. No, it's not going to solve the problem because the content will still be hosted somewhere. Someone will still be accepting credit cards for it. They're only going to see into our networks, a very limited amount of information. Somebody shared this file on a Comcast or a Time Warner or a Verizon network, and that's all they'll see. The bigger problem, I think, and probably the larger problem for the content industry is the proliferation of these file locker or similar sites where people put content up behind a website, behind a login, and it's very difficult to see what transactions are happening there if you're outside.
So have you any idea, any thoughts about how, because you're a content company as well, you could find your own content being ripped off in just that fashion?
Well, certainly, and my colleagues here who work on the anti-piracy side can speak better to this, but you can sign up for and join these websites, and you can look around. Search engines, many of them will index to these websites.
But I was trying to get, do you, as a corporately, do you have a strategy for dealing with that issue?
There is a strategy. It's a very active anti-piracy, initiative, multi-pronged, both in the U.S. and overseas, particularly on the NBC Universal side of the business, to address that. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be simpler just to have a piece of legislation which means that if internet service providers allow pirate content across their networks, they're simply prosecuted for aiding and abetting a crime? Well,
the internet service providers, unless you are very invasive and look at all the traffic your customers are sending around, which is technically and from a legal perspective and particularly from a privacy perspective impossible, you're never going to know. So I think internet service providers can play a valuable role. I think this alert system establishes that. But to your initial question, Steve, there are a number of other participants in the internet ecosystem that should be participating in this or something similar. Search, if you can't find it, you won't download it. Payment, if you pay for it, somebody's responsible, and I think the payment industry has been a good actor in that space. The e-commerce sites that promote the material, advertisers in general, the domain name system. I think that there's a lot of unexplored work to be done on the domain name system side, where a number of domains are set up and it's clear what their purpose is, and registries accept those registrations blindly.
So in addition to your voluntary efforts, would you support stronger legislative action to sort out some of these issues? Because there was an act, wasn't there? There were two, SOPA and the other one.
Oh, right.
Which were proposed, which were quite draconian, but some people thought, well, on balance, when if it's serious enough, then perhaps that is warranted.
Yeah.
Others are very worried about the effect it would have on internet freedom.
Right. I mean, so there's legitimate reasons for and legitimate criticisms there. I mean, we think this is something worth giving a try. We'd like to come back here in 2013 and tell you how it's doing, and I think we'll be able to report pretty positive results. It won't solve all the problems, but I think it'll make a big impact.
Okay. Well, Gerard Lewis, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.